Hey there, I'm Carl. Been a local newspaper columnist in this city for over 30 years, and let me tell you, I've seen some real jaw-droppers in my time. From wild scandals to the kind of stories that make you rethink everything you thought you knew. But this one is something else entirely. It's the story of a night that changed everything. A story about power, prejudice, and a mistake so big, it cost a man his whole career in a matter of seconds. It happened at 7:42 p.m., last Friday night. Inside the Rosewood, a luxury restaurant downtown known for its five-star dining and celebrity clientele, a scene unfolded that nobody in that room would ever forget. A white cop, Officer Bradley Monroe, stood with his gun drawn, hand shaking just slightly, as he aimed it directly at a black woman in a navy blue blazer, her hand still resting on the table, her expression calm, too calm for someone staring down the barrel of a loaded weapon. "Put your hands up," Monroe barked, his voice sharp, aggressive. His pulse was racing, his eyes locked onto the woman as if she were the most dangerous threat in the room. But she didn't move. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she took a slow sip of her wine, set the glass down with perfect ease, and then finally she smiled. That's when everything changed. Because as she reached into her blazer, not for a weapon, but for something far more deadly to Monroe's career, her voice came out smooth, steady, and filled with a quiet kind of power that sent a cold chill down his spine. "Officer," she said, flipping open a golden badge and setting it on the table like a winning poker hand. "I'm Special Agent Vanessa Carter, FBI." Silence. A kind of silence that made the entire restaurant feel smaller, tighter, like the walls were closing in. Bradley Monroe blinked. FBI. His stomach plummeted. And in that moment, just before the chaos truly unraveled, before the weight of what he had done came crashing down, one single thought ran through his head. "Oh God. What have I done?" The story didn't start there, though. No, it started much earlier. It started with a woman walking into a restaurant, just like any other customer. It started with a cop who made a very bad assumption. Let's go back to the beginning. It was a Friday night, and the Rosewood was packed with the city's elite, business moguls, socialites, and politicians, all dining under golden chandeliers, sipping aged wine, and pretending they weren't eavesdropping on the rich folks sitting 2 tables over. And right in the middle of it all, Vanessa Carter stepped inside, wearing a navy blue blazer, dark jeans, and a quiet confidence that turned heads without her even trying. She wasn't flashy. She didn't need to be. She was FBI. And if there's one thing FBI agents know how to do, it's how to blend in until they don't want to. She walked straight to her reserved table, nodding politely to the waiter, and took her seat. No big deal. Just another Friday night. Except for one thing. At the exact same moment, Officer Bradley Monroe was sitting at the bar, nursing a whiskey and feeling particularly self-important that night. Monroe wasn't just any cop. He was the kind of guy who believed in power, his own. The kind of guy who thought a badge made him untouchable. The kind of guy who had certain ideas about who belonged in places like this, and who didn't. So when he saw Vanessa Carter, a black woman alone, dressed in a way that screamed authority, his mind didn't go to FBI agent. It went somewhere much lower. Somewhere ugly. And that's where the trouble started. Monroe watched her closely. Too closely. His mind started spinning stories before he even realized he was doing it. Maybe she was here to meet someone wealthy, looking for a handout. Maybe she was an escort, waiting for some rich CEO to swoop in. Maybe she was a problem before she even opened her mouth. And as he watched her place her order with the waiter, calm, composed, confident, something inside him snapped. He wasn't even thinking straight when he stood up, whiskey glass clinking against the bar as he set it down too hard. Something about her confidence, the way she carried herself, bothered him. So he did what bad cops do. He let his assumptions make the decisions for him. Monroe marched over to her table, his boots heavy against the marble floor, ignoring the fact that nobody had called for him. Ignoring the fact that this was not his business. Ignoring the fact that he was about to make the worst mistake of his life. "Ma'am," he said sharply, standing just beside her table, his posture rigid. "I'm going to need to see some ID." Vanessa barely looked up. "Excuse me," she asked, more amused than anything. "You heard me," Monroe said, his voice harder now. "You don't seem like you belong here." And just like that, the whole restaurant shifted. People stopped talking. Glasses stopped clinking. The soft hum of background jazz felt louder. Vanessa finally turned her head, looking Monroe directly in the eye. "And why's that?" she asked. Monroe hesitated. He hadn't expected pushback. He hadn't expected her to challenge him. And that made him angrier. I need to see some ID, he repeated. Now. Vanessa sighed. She reached for her purse, moving too calmly, and something in Monroe's head snapped again. His hand went straight to his holster. And before he could think, before he could stop himself, before he could realize just how badly he was messing up, his gun was out, pointed directly at her. And that's where we came in. Where time froze. Where Monroe, standing there with his gun drawn, suddenly realized too late that he had made a mistake he could never undo. Because the woman sitting in front of him was not afraid. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't shaking. No, she was about to ruin his entire career. And all she had to do was tell the truth. Officer Bradley Monroe stood frozen, his gun still trained on the woman sitting before him, his mind racing faster than his heart. The world around him had stopped. People at nearby tables stared, mouths slightly open, silverware forgotten in midair. The only thing moving was the soft flicker of candlelight against the polished wood of the Rosewood's luxury dining hall. And Vanessa Carter? She was smiling. Not the kind of smile that says, everything is fine. No. This was the kind of smile that said, you just ruined your entire life. She reached into her blazer, slow and deliberate, her fingers wrapping around something solid. Monroe's grip on his gun tightened, his pulse hammering, his breathing shallow. His mouth opened to shout another order. But then, she pulled out a badge. A golden badge. One that gleamed under the dim restaurant lights like a loaded weapon. She set it on the table with a soft clink, right next to her untouched glass of wine. And then, with a voice so calm it was almost lethal, she said, I'm Special Agent Vanessa Carter, FBI. Monroe blinked. The room tilted around him. His grip on his gun loosened. His breath hitched. Because in that instant, he realized. He had just pulled a gun on a federal agent. The weight of what he had done crashed down on him like a falling building. He had assumed. He had judged. He had let his own twisted biases dictate his actions. And now he had pointed a loaded firearm at an FBI agent. And worse? Everyone had seen it. The waiter standing near the kitchen doors, the wealthy couple 2 tables away, the nervous restaurant manager peeking from behind the bar. The entire room had witnessed his career-ending mistake. A long, painful silence stretched between them. Then, Vanessa tilted her head slightly, her lips curling into something dangerously close to amusement. Well, she asked, her tone mockingly patient. Are you going to arrest me? Monroe's fingers trembled against the gun. His throat felt dry, as if his whole body was shutting down. And that's when it happened. A firm hand clamped down on his shoulder. Officer Monroe, a deep voice said. He turned his head slowly. Standing right behind him was his own captain, Captain James Holloway. And his face was stone cold. Monroe's stomach dropped straight through the floor. Because if the captain was here, that meant, oh God. This was worse than he thought. Holloway's grip on his shoulder tightened, his voice dangerously low. Put the gun down. Monroe's brain screamed at him to fix this, to explain, to justify, to do anything that could undo what had just happened. But there was nothing to fix. Nothing to justify. Nothing to undo. So with shaking hands, Monroe finally lowered his weapon. Click. The sound of the gun locking back into its holster echoed like a gavel in a courtroom. The entire restaurant exhaled in unison. Vanessa let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. Took you long enough, she muttered. The captain ignored her, his eyes locked onto Monroe like a predator about to end its prey. What the hell were you thinking? He growled. Monroe opened his mouth, his voice barely more than a whisper. Save it, Holloway snapped. His face was red, but not from anger. From embarrassment. From disgust. Not here, he said through clenched teeth. Outside. Now. Monroe didn't move. Because he knew. The moment he walked out of that restaurant, his career was over. And judging by the way his captain was looking at him, it was going to happen faster than he could even process. But before he could take a step, Vanessa leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, her voice dripping with something cold. Before you go, she said, I have just one question. Monroe stiffened. His captain didn't stop him. Just stood there, arms crossed, watching. Vanessa tapped a finger against her badge. "Tell me, Officer Monroe," she said. "If I were a white woman sitting here, minding my business, would you have done the same thing?" The words hit him like a gut punch. His jaw clenched. His fists curled. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to lie. But looking into her eyes, knowing that everyone was waiting for his answer, he realized that nobody in that room would believe him, because the truth was written all over his face. And before he could say anything, before he could try to dig himself out of this unfixable mess, his captain's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "Monroe," Holloway said. "You're done." Monroe's heart stopped. His breath hitched. "What?" he croaked. Holloway's eyes were ice. "You heard me," he said. "You're suspended effective immediately. Hand over your badge and gun." Monroe stood there, numb, as the words sank in. Suspended. No, no, no. This wasn't happening. This wasn't fair. His pulse pounded in his ears as the entire restaurant watched him fall. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, taking another slow sip of wine as if she had all the time in the world. And with a smirk, she muttered, "Should have just let me enjoy my dinner." Monroe's knees buckled. His captain held out his hand. "Badge and gun, Monroe. Now." And at that moment, right there in the middle of that luxury restaurant, surrounded by people who would never forget what they had just seen, Officer Bradley Monroe realized something. He had just lost everything. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. Officer Bradley Monroe stood there, stiff as a statue, staring at his captain's outstretched hand. The weight of the moment crushed him, pressing against his chest like a steel beam. He could feel every pair of eyes in the restaurant glued to him, watching, whispering, judging. But none of them mattered. None of them were as terrifying as the one thing he never thought he'd hear in his career. Badge and gun, Monroe. Now. His entire world was shattering in slow motion. He opened his mouth, searching for an excuse, an explanation, anything that could make this nightmare go away. "Captain, Now." Holloway's voice was ice. And that's when Monroe knew. There was no talking his way out of this. His throat felt dry as he slowly reached for his badge. For a split second, his fingers hesitated. Because the moment he handed it over, it was real. He was done. Finished. His career, his power gone. But there was no way out. With trembling hands, he unhooked his badge and gun, placing them into his captain's palm. It felt worse than death. Holloway closed his fingers around them. Then, without another word, he turned and walked towards the exit, expecting Monroe to follow. Monroe could barely move his feet. But he forced himself to walk, his legs heavy, his body moving like he was marching toward his own execution. He could hear the whispers as he passed by the tables. "That's the guy who pulled a gun on an FBI agent? He just lost his job in real time. Good. He deserved it." The last one made his blood boil. He was a cop. He had served the city for 10 years. And now? Now he was being thrown away like garbage, over a misunderstanding. It wasn't fair. The doors to the Rosewood swung open, and Monroe was shoved back into reality. The cool night air hit him like a slap, but it wasn't as cold as the look on Holloway's face. The captain turned to him, his lips pressed into a tight line, his hands gripping Monroe's gun and badge like a judge holding a guilty verdict. "You want to explain to me," Holloway said, his voice dangerously low, "what the hell you were thinking back there?" Monroe swallowed hard. "Captain, she looked suspicious. I didn't know who she was." Holloway's eyes darkened. "You mean," he said slowly, "she looked black." Monroe's stomach flipped. That's not what I meant." Monroe stammered. "Then what did you mean?" Holloway shot back. "Because from where I was standing, you saw a black woman sitting alone in a nice restaurant, assumed she didn't belong, and pulled a loaded gun on her before you even asked a damn question." Monroe's hands curled into fists. "She could have been a threat," he snapped. "She could have been a criminal. She was an FBI agent, you idiot." Holloway roared. "A federal agent. Do you even understand what you just did?" Monroe froze. Because the next words out of Holloway's mouth knocked the air out of his lungs. "You didn't just lose your badge tonight," Holloway growled. "You just put yourself under federal investigation." Monroe staggered. His breath hitched. "Wait, what?" Holloway ran a hand down his face like he was physically restraining himself from punching Monroe in the jaw. You pulled a weapon on an FBI agent in a public place, with witnesses, and for what? Because she had a seat you didn't think she deserved. Captain, You are done, Monroe. Holloway's voice was final. The department will not be defending you on this. You are being placed under internal review immediately. And trust me, after tonight, the feds are gonna want a piece of this too. Monroe felt nauseous. Internal review. Federal investigation. This wasn't just about his badge anymore. This was about prison. His knees felt weak. His body swayed slightly. No, come on, Captain, you can't do this, Monroe said quickly, his voice verging on desperation. I've been on the force for a decade. I've put bad guys behind bars, You just became the bad guy, Monroe. The words stabbed. Holloway took a step back, disgust clear on his face. Go home, he ordered. Don't say another damn word to anyone. And pray to whatever God you believe in that Agent Carter doesn't decide to press federal charges. Monroe's face turned white. His lips parted slightly. Because he hadn't even thought about that. Vanessa Carter could bury him. If she wanted to. She had the power. She had the witnesses. She had everything. And for the first time that night, Monroe felt something he had never truly felt before. Fear. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Because there was nothing left to say. Holloway turned his back to him, shaking his head as he walked away, muttering one last thing before disappearing into the night. You did this to yourself. The streetlights buzzed overhead, flickering against Monroe's pale face as he stood there, powerless. For the first time in his career, he wasn't the one in control. And the worst part? This was only the beginning. Because while he stood there, drowning in regret, Vanessa Carter was making a phone call. And the real consequences? They were just getting started. Officer Bradley Monroe sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mind was spinning, his stomach twisting itself into knots. The words kept replaying in his head. You didn't just lose your badge tonight. You're under federal investigation. Federal investigation. This wasn't a suspension. This wasn't desk duty. This was his entire life crashing down. He tried to breathe, but each inhale felt sharp, like his own lungs were betraying him. His hands were still shaking from the scene at the restaurant, from the gun in his grip, from the way Vanessa Carter had looked at him. Not afraid, not intimidated, just disappointed. And now? Now she was making a phone call. And he had no idea what was coming next. Across town, inside a dimly lit office, Vanessa Carter leaned back in her chair, her phone pressed to her ear. The voice on the other end was calm but serious. You're sure about this, Carter? She exhaled. He pulled a loaded gun on me for sitting in a restaurant. What do you think? A pause. Then. All right. Consider it handled. Click. The call ended. Vanessa didn't move. Didn't blink. She just sat there, staring at the badge on her desk, running a slow finger over the edge. She had seen cops like Monroe before. Too many times. Men who carried a badge like it made them gods. Men who thought their uniforms were shields, who thought they could do whatever they wanted without consequences. But Monroe? He had picked the wrong person to target. And by sunrise, he was going to understand that. Bradley Monroe woke up to the sound of pounding on his front door. It was sharp, aggressive, official. His heart stopped. He stumbled out of bed, still in the clothes from last night, a cold sweat clinging to his skin. He knew that knock. He had done that knock before. And it only meant one thing. This was not a courtesy visit. He rushed to the door, his pulse hammering. Through the peephole, he saw 3 men in suits standing outside. Federal agents. His stomach plummeted. His fingers trembled as he unlocked the door, forcing it open. The man in front, a sharp-jawed agent with steel-cold eyes, flashed a badge. Officer Bradley Monroe. Monroe swallowed hard. Yeah, he croaked. You need to come with us. Monroe hesitated. His body screamed at him to slam the door shut and run. But he couldn't. Because if he ran, that would make things 1,000 times worse. What is this about? He tried, his voice wavering. The agent didn't blink. Your actions last night have triggered an official federal review. You're being brought in for questioning. Monroe's hands went clammy. A federal review. He had heard those words before. And he knew exactly what they meant. This wasn't just about getting fired anymore. This was about whether or not he was going to jail. An hour later, Monroe sat inside a cold, windowless room at the Federal Building, his knee bouncing under the table. Across from him sat two agents. One of them, the man who had knocked on his door, had no expression. Just a blank stare and a thick file in front of him. The other was Vanessa Carter. Monroe's stomach churned as she leaned forward, her elbows resting on the table, her eyes locked onto him. "Well," she said, her voice smooth, "looks like we meet again." Monroe opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Because in this room, in this moment, he was no longer the cop in charge. She was. She glanced at the file in front of her, flipping it open. "Let's go over a few things, shall we?" she said. "You're Officer Bradley Monroe. Been on the force for 10 years. Multiple complaints filed against you, excessive force, racial profiling, improper conduct." Monroe's jaw clenched. "All unproven," he muttered. Vanessa smirked. "Until last night," she said, tapping the file. Monroe's throat tightened. Vanessa leaned in, her voice dropping slightly. "You pointed a gun at a federal agent. In a crowded restaurant. With witnesses." She tilted her head. "Tell me, Monroe, what exactly did you think was going to happen?" Monroe gritted his teeth. "It was a mistake," he muttered. You thought I didn't belong there," she finished for him. "That's what you thought." Silence. Thick. Suffocating. Vanessa let it hang for a moment before she closed the file, exhaling through her nose. "Here's what's happening, Monroe," she said, standing up. "You're officially under criminal investigation. Your department has dropped you. And given that you're facing federal charges, I'd say your chances of avoiding prison are—" She glanced at the other agent beside her. "Pretty slim, wouldn't you say?" The agent nodded. Monroe's chest tightened. This couldn't be happening. This was his life. His career. And it was being ripped away in real time. Vanessa picked up the file, tapping it against the table before giving Monroe one last look. "Enjoy the ride, Monroe," she said, smirking. Then she turned and walked out. And just like that, Officer Bradley Monroe was done. For good. Officer Bradley Monroe sat in the cold, windowless interrogation room, staring at the table, his entire world crumbling around him. Federal charges. A criminal investigation. His badge gone. His gun taken. His future ruined. Everything he had built over 10 years had been erased in a single night. And worst of all, there was nothing he could do about it. Vanessa Carter had made sure of that. Monroe was still in the interrogation room when the news hit the streets. The first report came from Channel 5 News. Then it spread like wildfire. By noon, every news station, radio host, and social media platform was talking about it. Police Scarlight breaking news. Police officer under federal investigation after pulling gun on FBI agent in luxury restaurant. Police Scarlight. The headlines were brutal. Oncoming police car officer Monroe suspended indefinitely, faces possible federal charges. Loudspeaker, another case of racial profiling gone too far. Fire officer's career ends in 30 seconds, here's how. And the worst part? There was video. The footage that sealed his fate. Someone in the restaurant, maybe a waiter, maybe a guest, had filmed the entire thing. The video showed Monroe standing over Vanessa, gun pointed at her face, barking orders like she was some dangerous suspect. Then it showed her flipping her badge onto the table. The look on Monroe's face when he realized his mistake? Priceless. By the time the video hit Twitter, it was over. Police Scarlight, this racist cop pulled a gun on a woman just for sitting at a table, then found out she was FBI. Face with tears of joy, face with tears of joy. Oncoming police Scar, this is why we need accountability. Imagine if she wasn't FBI. What would have happened then? Speech balloon, this dude is about to be in the unemployment line with no pension. Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. Monroe's phone was blowing up. His email? Flooded. Even his own colleagues had started unfollowing him. Because nobody wanted to be associated with him now. Not after this. Monroe was escorted into a new room, where 3 men in suits were waiting. His police chief. A federal investigator. And a lawyer from the department. It wasn't a conversation. It was a funeral. For his career. The police chief didn't sugarcoat it. Monroe, effective immediately, you're being terminated from the force. Monroe's stomach dropped. You have the right to contest the decision, but considering the evidence, and the fact that you're under federal review, there's nothing we can do to save you. Monroe felt his breath hitch. This was it. They weren't just suspending him. They weren't just firing him. They were erasing him. Everything he had worked for, gone. And then came the worst part. The federal investigator leaned forward. Officer Monroe, you should know that the FBI has decided to move forward with an official civil rights violation case against you. Monroe's head snapped up. Wait, what? The investigator's face was stone cold. Your actions last night fall under unlawful use of force and racial discrimination. And since Special Agent Carter was the victim, this case has federal attention. Monroe's throat went dry. This wasn't just losing his badge. This wasn't just losing his job. This was prison. He felt like he was sinking, drowning in a mistake he couldn't take back. This is ridiculous, he barked, slamming his hands on the table. It was a misunderstanding. The investigator didn't blink. Tell that to the judge. Monroe left the federal building in a daze, his hands shaking, his future shattered. And then, the reporters pounced. Cameras. Microphones. Shouting voices. Officer Monroe, do you regret what happened? Do you have anything to say to Special Agent Carter? Do you think you were treated unfairly? Monroe tried to shove past them, but there was nowhere to hide. He was public enemy number one. A fallen cop. A walking cautionary tale. And then, just as he reached his car, a black SUV pulled up. The door opened. Vanessa Carter stepped out. She was calm, collected, untouchable. She locked eyes with Monroe for a single silent second. Then, without saying a word, she smirked and walked right past him. Monroe felt his entire body go cold. Because that smirk? It told him everything. He had lost. He had destroyed himself. And Vanessa Carter had made sure he'd never forget it. Officer Bradley Monroe was no longer Officer Monroe. He was a convicted felon. Fired. Disgraced. Stripped of his badge, his pension, his reputation. Vanessa Carter? She was promoted. Her career had skyrocketed after the case. She became a public figure, an advocate for justice, a name everyone respected. Monroe had tried to fight back. Tried to sue. Tried to claim he had been set up. But nobody listened. Because the truth was on tape. And now? Now he was just a cautionary tale. A reminder that power is only borrowed. And if you abuse it, it gets taken away. For good.